The Civil War started when the President General, Carlos Humberto Romero, was overthrown in a coup in October 1979 by the revolutionary government junta. Because of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, the US President Jimmy Carter feared that El Salvador would fall into communist hands, similar to Cuba and Nicaragua, and spent money on their government in hopes of stabilizing it. The next president, Ronald Reagan, followed through and spent nearly $1 billion in economic aid. It is important to note that only 15% of the civilian deaths were caused by the FMLN, and 85% of the deaths were caused by the El Salvadoran government's death squads, which was funded and trained by the US.
The reason behind the murders of the innocent civilians was because of the fact that the El Salvadoran population had a large socioeconomic difference between the rich and the poor. This fact was the reason for attacking poor civilians because when a communist insurgency seemed likely, the El Salvador government, which was highly influenced by the rich elites, made it their priority to stop the pro-communism movement so that they would not lose their wealth. At the time which this was occurring, the Cold War was also taking place, and because of this fact, the US viewed the El Salvadoran government as an ally and sent funding and trained death squads to help suppress the pro-communist rebels. To stop a leftist takeover, counterinsurgency tactics were employed by such death squads and other armed forces from the military. However, in practice, the tactics were targeted against the civilians indiscriminately, and the reasons behind the murders were illegitimate and purely born out of hatred.
As mentioned previously, groups backed by the government were mainly responsible for civilian casualties. Responsible for almost 85% of the deaths, groups such as the ESAF and the death squads were the groups that targeted the peasant class. ESAF, El Salvadoran Armed Forces, was a group of untrained military soldiers sent by the government that used military tactics on unarmed citizens. Death squads were military personnel who were trained by the US that tortured the minorities during the genocide.
Responsible for about 15% of the murders, the Farabunda Marti National Liberation Front, or the FMLN, also carried out acts of violence against their own countrymen. With all of this taking place, the US trained a group called the Atacama Battalion in the US Army School of Americas. The main purpose of this group was to rescue the El Masti people by eliminating the presence of the FMLN in the villages.
As mentioned previously, because the main villainous force acting in the El Salvadoran genocide targeted poor civilians indiscriminately, specific cultures were not necessarily put in danger. However, the legacy of the civilians and their fellow countrymen who fought against the corrupt government continues today. For example, the FMLN, which was an umbrella organization formed from 5 leftist guerrilla organizations that fought against the government, lives on today as a legal and official major political party in El Salvador.
Of course, all armed units of the FMLN have been demobilized and have even won the presidential elections in 2009, with former journalist Mauricio Funes as its candidate. As for the victims in particular, they still have not given up on their own fight and continue to fight for justice today. An example of this is Darila Marquez, who is a survivor that retells the horrible acts of violence that were carried out at the massacre in the Salvadoran village of El Mozote, in which the average age of the murders was 6.
Recently, pleas for justice have been answered with a provincial judge ordering retired military commanders in Salvador to hear charges of war crimes for the massacres in El Mozote. While this active justice is long overdue with this trial to take place almost 40 years after the crimes were committed, the trial is a surefire sign that points to many more acts of justice to come.